Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Just making sure everything is okay, just making sure that's running up and nicely. Thank you so much for joining this session. My name is Steve, and I'm a developer relations lead here in New Relic. What I fundamentally do is I work with developers, engineers, operations engineer in making sure that you know how to use the New Relic platform, but I also talk about technology trends and passing feedback, especially your feedback to product engineering, on areas that we need to improve right here. So today I'm going to talk about open source instrumentation. To be more specific, when I say open source instrumentation, it's called OpenTelemetry. Right here, this is a workshop. Trying to do this virtually, running a workshop is actually quite challenging. But if you're attending the session, I don't want you to be stressed out. Don't worry if you can't get it working, because I have a cheat sheet for you so that you can bypass everything and everything just work magically on the back end. Again, I'll try my best to showcase to you what we're going to go through, but don't stress out because there's a lot of things that we can do on the back end right there. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. First and foremost, before I continue on, I just want to explain, in the world of OpenTelemetry, it is the second most popular project in CNCF. CNCF stands for Cloud Native Computing Foundation, where it's actually quite popular right now. Because of that, it's not like Kubernetes or some of the more mature technology where the standards and what you do is actually well defined. Therefore, it's also affecting us, especially us like New Relic, but also even open source community. The standards are changing, and therefore sometimes certain features in UI will change too. Again, I like to joke that this particular slide is to keep us safe, safe from legal, and we all don't get into trouble right there. So as mentioned earlier, today I'm going to talk about open telemetry in the world of observability. As mentioned earlier, CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Kubernetes is actually the most popular one. But the second project that's most popular in the world of CNCF is actually OpenTelemetry. In a nutshell, what is OpenTelemetry? OpenTelemetry is like the early days of browsers. If you remember, like Netscape, Internet Explorer, Google Chrome, Firefox, back in the early days, each browser has an opinion how you should instrument something. That's really great. But right now, we're going through what I call a standardization of instrumentation. And what you see in the world of OpenTelemetry is something that's essentially done through the open source initiative right there. For us in New Relic, it doesn't matter, actually. We do support OpenTelemetry. In fact, a lot of data that we see in New Relic actually come from open source data. In fact, almost more than one third of the data is coming into New Relic. They're all coming on through like open source data or third-party data that's traditionally not New Relic based or not using New Relic agent. If you're relatively new to this, especially in a workshop, I've been through a lot of workshops to understand. The first half an hour is probably the most important one. So what I'm going to do is I'm just gonna explain a bit more some of the design considerations and guidelines you need to be mindful if you're going to adopt OpenTelemetry. Now, as mentioned earlier, the original workshop right here is actually 1.5 hours. Like I run workshop with customers and meetups and conference, and for me, try to speed run this in 15 minutes. I'm going to focus on key concepts. Again, if you're going through this workshop, don't stress out. Don't worry if you can't get a workshop. I'd rather you understand concepts. I'd rather you think about use case. I'd rather that you think about the things that's much more important compared to like just talking about or try to do the workshop right there. Okay, again, don't stress out. There's the whole workshop right here, just making sure that you learn something. So as mentioned earlier, open telemetry is getting more prominent in the industry. And right now, I can say probably the biggest deployment of open telemetry that we can find publicly available that's being available in the internet is Line. So Line is actually a chat app where you have WhatsApp, you have Facebook Messenger, you have Telegram, and Line is fairly popular, especially in Japan, Korea, Thailand, and Southeast Asia. So they pretty much talk about they transition and they're a big adopter of open telemetry. So open telemetry is part of CNCF Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's a merger between open tracing and open census. If you're curious what open tracing and open census is, so open tracing formats such as Zipkin or Jaeger, so they are open source tracing format that usually being open source in the world, they merge into open tracing. And open census is something what Prometheus is using right now. If you're using Prometheus to actually instrument and just pretty much see what's going on in the environment, Prometheus uses open census tracing, what I call metrics format that essentially came from Google. And what happened right now with open tracing and open census is actually merging into one open source standard called OpenTelemetry. So OpenTelemetry is a combination of open tracing, Zipkin Jaeger, and open census, which is what Prometheus is using right now in CNCF. So what OpenTelemetry is actually a set of APIs, SDKs, where it's vendor agnostic, where it's not tied to any proprietary instrumentation. What I mean is something like New Relic or any proprietary vendor or any open source. It's not subject to an opinion, because in the past, even New Relic, usually go for a specific vendor is because the way how they instrument a specific app. In the world of OpenTelemetry, they promise to democratize that. And on the back end, it standardized how you collect telemetry, and you can send to any data of your platform. Any choice, doesn't matter. It can be New Relic, it can be any proprietary platform, it could be open source. So you have a lot of freedom of choice. That's why I talk about open source instrumentation and the rise of OpenTelemetry. There are four key value propositions that you always see when people talk about the rise of OpenTelemetry. First is better coverage, especially if you are using some of the more cloud native frameworks like Golang or maybe Node.js or some of the more modern programming language. OpenTelemetry promises better coverage because those framework comes with instrumentation. The second one is vendor neutral, where you have the ability to change backend whenever you want. It could be AWS, it could be GCP, doesn't matter. Where you have a lot of flexibility in changing on your backend right there. Interoperable. This is where the holy grail of OpenTelemetry that everyone's trying to achieve right there, where you have interoperable tracing or trace data, where you have OpenTelemetry and maybe non-OpenTelemetry traces that can interoperate together within one trace. This is the holy grail that everybody is trying to get into, including us too, New Relic, and in the world of open source. And lastly is configurable. The good thing about OpenTelemetry is everything is configurable, from instrumentation, from collection, from the data source. Everything is customizable, and you have absolute control right there. So even Gartner said that roughly by 2025, a lot of cloud native, born in the cloud application will use some form of open source instrumentation. When we say open source instrumentation, what we really mean, and most likely, is OpenTelemetry right there. So if OpenTelemetry is really that good, and we should say, hey, why don't we just go straight into it, or everyone just jump into it? But the reality is you got to be mindful, because as mentioned earlier, OpenTelemetry is still relatively new in the industry. Therefore, you need to be mindful of some of the design consideration. As mentioned earlier, it's not that mature, and I use a non-technical way of explaining OpenTelemetry right now. And arguably, this is probably the most important decision that you need to make and decide if OpenTelemetry is right for you. So the non-technical way of explaining is I use cakes or pastry as a way of explaining OpenTelemetry. So for example, if you ever go to a cake shop or pastry shop, if you buy a croissant or maybe a chocolate pastry or a chocolate cake, strawberry cake or whatever, you kind of know how much you're going to pay, and you kind of know the experience of consuming that cake or that pastry. Right now, proprietary solutions or mature solutions such as New Relic, what we call an end product, where when you onboard an instrumentation package, you know what you're going to get. It's ready to go, it's packaged, it's scalable, it's mature, and you know what you're gonna see within the backend platform. That's actually right now with the New Relic platform, but also with what we call the curated experience with other providers too. OpenTelemetry is kind of like here on the left-hand side, where you can pretty much customize everything. Again, I use cakes and pastry as an example. Maybe you have gluten-free, or maybe vegetarian, or maybe certain dietary requirements where you have to customize everything. Maybe the eggs, the flour, the milk. You got to decide what you need to do. That's where OpenTelemetry makes sense, because within the instrumentation and collector, you can decide what you want to configure. And right now in the world of OpenTelemetry, languages like Java and .NET, they're very mature, but other languages like Node or Golang, they're not that mature. It's not that they're not that mature, it's just that they don't have very flesh out standards and documentation as mature like Java. But you got to understand, Java and .NET has been around for a really long time. And a lot of developers have a lot of experience with Java and .NET, and therefore, when they create standards, they know what should be created and what shouldn't be. So you just need to be mindful when you get into the world of OpenTelemetry. There are 6 design considerations you need to be mindful of. So when I often look at talks, or even customers doing it, when I look at people talk about OpenTelemetry, I always ask, and I always kind of question, yeah, it's pretty cool with OpenTelemetry, but have you really tried to implement in production? Because it's a very different experience. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but you got to do it not because it's cool. You got to do it because the use case is right. So first and foremost, what you want to do right here is if you look at the Gartner hype, what I call the Gartner hype chart right there, you can see concepts like observability, tracing. They're much more mature because the definition for what observability and distributed tracing is much more mature, and people know what it is. But if you look at OpenTelemetry, it's still relatively new. So your first step is you need to understand is if you're still confused and you're debating and you're asking questions, what's the difference between monitoring and observability? OpenTelemetry might not be right for you because OpenTelemetry follows a lot of concepts that you see in the world of observability. Do you understand the basics of metrics, logs, and traces? If you're still debating, what's right or wrong, and you still prefer to only work in the world of metrics, so metrics is like infrastructure metrics, like CPU, memory, like 80%. Logs is something that a lot of engineers really love. You have unstructured logs that really kind of record everything, and then you have traces, what I call distributed tracing. Let's see requests propagated through a microservice environment. If you still don't really understand what's the difference between two of them, you're going to have a lot of trouble because in the world of OpenTelemetry, tracing is the most mature one. So therefore leads to the third one right there. Do you use tracing in your environment? If you don't, you will not see the value of OpenTelemetry because tracing is the most mature one. And the last three one is probably arguably the hardest one is if your development team is not comfortable with tinkering with code or manual instrumentation or changing standards, you're going to have a lot of trouble with OpenTelemetry. I'm not saying there are no teams that can do this. In fact, if you are a team and you can adapt to technology and you are comfortable tinkering with the app, you should give yourself a pat on the back. Means you have a really strong engineering culture. But unless you have that, I suggest you got to be very careful when you touch OpenTelemetry right there, because with OpenTelemetry, once the standard change, you have to change your instrumentation. So what we're going to do with the workshop right there is we're going to go through a cloud native environment right there. We're going to go through part 1, instrumentation, but also part 2, the collector right there. So what we're going to do here in this particular workshop is we're going to use what I call the GCP signature online boutique shop. So if you've ever worked with GCP before, GCP always like to use this application stack to demonstrate a lot of things like Google Anthos, like a lot of application, even OpenTelemetry too. So what we did right there is because this stack uses open source format, we don't need to be worried about being tied to GCP. And that's the beauty about OpenTelemetry. And what we did right there is we retrofitted that particular stack, decoupled from GCP, and using OpenTelemetry format, which is open source instrumentation. And from there, we can see how data looks like in the world of New Relic. Again, this is not New Relic specific. This is not a course about New Relic. This course is fundamentally talk about OpenTelemetry, and I'm going to talk a bit more on the concept of tracing right there. So what we're going to do is in any workshop, I'm going to deploy the environment first. Let's deploy first and we can see things in action later on so that I can cover a bit more on the concept right there and we can work on from there. Okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go into the environment. I'm going to deploy this and you can follow along. Again, don't worry about it if you can't really see this, but I'm just going to show you because it's actually much easier so that I don't really worry about troubleshooting or whatever right there. So as mentioned earlier, if you're interested in learning this and doing this yourself, just feel free to send me an email or just reach out to me privately. I'm more than happy to actually do this because I usually do this for customers, meet out conference. And what we're doing right here is called the FOC stack. The FOC stack, the FOK stack, stands for Fluentbit, OpenTelemetry, and Kubernetes right there. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to deploy my lab. And what you see is actually called Instruct. It's actually not in AWS, GCP, or Azure. It's just a VM as a service that we use internally right here to actually run workshop. So where we don't really worry about configurations and anything. And we're going to deploy first, and that one will take a bit of time. While this is deploying, I'm going to move on the other side and really talk about the concept of OpenTelemetry, because this part right here is going to take a bit of a while. The reason because it's going to take a while because we are actually deploying Kubernetes, we're deploying containers, we're getting all the code underneath it right there. Therefore, it's going to take a bit of a while. As mentioned earlier, don't stress out. I'd rather you focus on the concept because that's the most important part right there. Okay. Now, while this is being deployed, we're going to deploy the environment, and it might take around 10 to 15 minutes. While that's being deployed, I will take this opportunity to talk about OpenTelemetry. Like for me, I've been running workshops for quite a long time, and I know the only first half an hour that people are going to pay the most attention. After that, I'm going to start losing you. So I rather focus on the most important part. We talk about OpenTelemetry, and we get into the workshop. I'm going to show you later on how things work on later on underneath the hood. Okay. So number one, let's talk about instrumentation. As mentioned earlier, OpenTelemetry is an open standards where people come together, including New Relic, including open source, and all the vendors that we come in, and we have an opinion how instrumentation will look like. The definition of instrumentation is when you onboard, let's say, a specific agent, it will go out and automatically discover what the application is doing, and it will report things like error rate, latency, traffic, and saturation using the foregoing signals right there. Traditionally in the past, like all vendors have their opinion how you should instrument Java or maybe a .NET application. But right now it's coming to a form where it's going through an open source effort where everyone should contribute, or maybe having a vendor neutral approach in doing certain things. That's not bad. The reason is because, especially in the world of Java, you see this a lot. Java community has a very strong opinion how you should instrument something. Now, the good thing about understanding OpenTelemetry is not only you have an opportunity to understand what New Relic is doing, you have an opportunity to understand what everybody is doing, but you also have an opportunity to understand what open source is doing. So understanding OpenTelemetry is an opportunity like, baking a cake or making your own cake. We start with the eggs, the flour, and everything, the fundamentals. So you kind of know what everyone's doing through OpenTelemetry. So first and foremost, in the world of OpenTelemetry, they have this concept called semantic conventions. So semantic conventions is actually a way where it says, actually, there's a HTTP call. This is how you should call an operation. If it's a background job, a non-HTTP calls, or gRPC, this is how you should label certain things. So there is certain rules. You can't really make them up. You have to follow what we call semantic conventions. And after that, in the world of OpenTelemetry, we have this concept called the API layer. The API layer is actually 3 different telemetry types: tracing, metrics, and logging data. Tracing is very good for high-level instrumentation where you understand your service requests from A, B, and C. Metrics is the aggregation of data, such as for example, like a response time or CPU metrics like 80% or 50%. And logging is actually the logging of data, like all the errors or debug logs and whatever right there. An SDK is actually a package that people actually wrap around the application itself. It could be Python, it could be PHP, it could be Java, it could be .NET. SDK, another way of saying it, it's not an agent or a library just wrapped around the application. And lastly, sometimes people send data through a HTTP pipeline or maybe a gRPC. In the world of OpenTelemetry, they call it OpenTelemetry Protocol, OTLP. That's how you send data out on the backend. Now, within the cell, what we're going to do is, as mentioned earlier, this is the course workshop on tracing. If you attended my previous course previously on OpenAPI, and I talk about how I use tracing as a way of pinpointing where there's an issue. The reason is because this is API days, and there's a lot of focus on building an API service architecture, either on-prem, maybe you're building your own API architecture, or maybe you're using a cloud-based service that's leveraging an API. Like it or not, you need to find out where the bottleneck is. Is it your app, or is it the API that's having an issue right there? So the good thing about tracing is it actually tells you the story of the service request that traverse through a microservice architecture. A, B, C, D, E. It's just like traveling. It tells you the whole journey, what's going on right there. After that, with observability, what we're doing is actually pinpointing exactly and adding more context to an attribute right there. As mentioned earlier, although I'm using the New Relic platform, but the principle I'm teaching you also is applicable to the world of open source. We're adding observations, improving observability by adding more attributes right there. So you can see, here's an example. If there's an issue, how does it look like on the back end? Would it be cool if we can find the order ID or the transaction ID right there? Okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go back into my workshop and just want to check on my my lab right here, just making sure everything is okay. So I'm going to go into my workshop and just to validate everything is okay. So let me just go back in. All right. So the first thing that what I'm going to do is, as mentioned earlier, I'm going to do a quick check because I just deployed Kubernetes. I just want to make sure that I deploy, making sure all my binary is good. So it's definitely good. I got my Minikube deployed. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a kubectl get notes, making sure my Kubernetes deployed correctly. I'm going to do kubectl get parts to make sure all my namespace is being deployed correctly too. Looks like it's all good, right? So that's the first step. I'm deploying, making sure everything is okay. Now, Kubernetes is a fairly large app, as mentioned earlier. This is actually deployed by Kubernetes. Sorry about that. This app is actually built by GCP, therefore it's a really large app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with next. Again, I'm going to deploy first. I'm going to do something on later on. So what I'm going to do is, again, with this slide, I'm going to first put my environable variables right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy out my environable variables just to kind of make things easy. So environable variables is something that's quite common that when you deploy an environment, you don't hard code stuff. You just don't hard code it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paste 1, 2, 3, just to make it really safe. And what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to do scaffold def. I'm going to deploy my service just to make sure everything is okay. So right here, what we're doing is going back to this application. We deploy the Kubernetes. We're going out to GCR. So GCR is GCP Containers Registry. We're actually go grabbing all the containers that's relevant to this environment, and we build the containers right there. Sorry about that. Just drinking a bit of water to make sure everything is okay. So as mentioned earlier, if you're interested with this workshop, just feel free to reach out to me privately. I can send you this link and all the instructions available to you, and we'll go through this build. Again, as mentioned, just looking through this build is actually really boring. It's really nothing exciting around it. It's just going to go through again, and it takes around additional 5 to 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip back just to explain, talk a bit more what we're doing right there. So going back right here in this particular view, what we're doing is we're actually deploying this whole application right here with all the code. So right here, what underneath it is we have a mixture of Golang, Python, Java, everything using gRPC. We have Istio, we have everything all deployed. And the beauty about this, because they use OpenTelemetry, we can actually pipe it up into, let's say, New Relic or any open source data platform that you have on the back end. So what we have right there is once we deploy, you will see several objects that's being created in the New Relic platform. We have front end, which is right here. We have all the service dependencies actually right here. And as mentioned earlier, tracing is a very nice way where you can see the data propagation between services that's going right here. So if you remember my talk back then when I did an API days, I'm using an API service called OpenAI. So OpenAI is a software as a service, cloud-based offering where they democratize AI service, where I couldn't put anything in OpenAI, but I still need to understand, is it us or for them? And therefore, I use tracing as a way of doing it. In a nutshell, what tracing is actually request propagation. So for example, tracing will actually do a marking right here and say, hey, we have a service is coming here, it's going to here, and from here, it's going to somewhere. And the secret sauce, how tracing work underneath it right here is actually using HTTP request headers. HTTP request header is actually done automatically in New Relic. It's done automatically through some open source agent. But in a nutshell, what we're doing is we're passing HTTP headers and saying that, oh, I know you're coming from this app. We're going to speak to this app. oh, this transaction right here goes to another one. And therefore, this is how tracing was able to understand this is related to this is related to this. So that's the basics of tracing. Within tracing, they have this concept called spans. So spans is actually what I call the first level instrumentation, where I determine, okay, we have front end application. What is the first level class, method, or function that's actually understood that actually make that service request call? So in the world of tracing, they have this concept called span. We're going to see that later on when we go into it. So you can see right here, it's still being deployed, but we're very close to completion. So there's one more thing that I'm just going through and just to make sure everything is okay. Okay? So we're just going to wait a bit more and we're good for that. So we're deploying this lab. We're getting close to getting good. So I'm just going to fast forward a bit. So this is the data that we're going to see a bit later on, where we're going to do instrumentation. All right, now data is actually appearing in the environment right here. We can see that data is flowing and it's actually reporting data into the platform. So what we're doing right here is taking that stack that I mentioned early. We are actually pushing OpenTelemetry data into the platform, and we can see what's going on right there. So let me just do a quick refresh. All right, so what I'm showing you right here is just an example of a new Relic platform. Again, the instrumentation on the front end is all open source. On the back end, we're just using New Relic as a way of lighting that data up. As mentioned earlier, what we do right here is we can see OpenTelemetry services that actually occur on the back end. And if we go to front end, which I've shown you earlier, we can start seeing data is actually flowing in the platform right there. In the world of OpenTelemetry, the most mature one is tracing. Therefore, we're actually using tracing data, and we actually use that data to actually map out things like response time, throughput, error rate, and all the service dependencies around that you see on the right-hand side right there. Now, when you go to distributed tracing right here, you can see all the trace data that's actually recording right now that the application is generating right there. And when we click on it, you will see actually a scattered plot graph to actually tell you when things go well and when things doesn't go well. This is relatively important. The reason is because you want to know when things go well and when things doesn't go well. So it's actually fairly important on both sides. So that's why you actually want to look into it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick a specific trace, and you can actually see the trace propagation that's going on right there. So what you see right there is you can see this particular trace coming from the front end. You can see all the trace propagation that's going on the back end. You can see all the spans that's actually going on underneath right there. So you can see there's quite a lot of stuff that actually tells you and actually pinpoint to you when something goes wrong. Okay, so that's the basic of tracing. So what we're going to do right here is I'm going to use my code and I'm going to go straight to the solution right there so that you can see and give some time back so that you, just in case you want to ask some questions right there. Okay. Let me just get a sip of water. So far, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to summary. I'm going to go to this particular app called shipping service because that's our focus right there. If I go to tracing, I go to, transaction, and I go to get quote, and I go to tracing right there, and I can see all my trace data. So the one that's probably much more interested is the checkout thing. So again, just imagine this is an e-commerce website. There's a lot of application that's flowing through. What we want to see is the service dependency around it. So when I click here, I can see that service propagation from front end to different services right here. After that, from this service, it goes out even more. And this is very handy steps in telling you, hey, something's broken or not. When you scroll down a bit more, you could see all what we call first level instrumentation of that span, and it tells you a good enough information to tell you what's going on. Again, it's not designed to go deep, because when you want to go deep, you need to use something like logs. Again, this is just not a new Relic problem. It's just It's just you want to use the right instrumentation for the right problem right there. So you can see right there, we can see the difference time that's being spent in each layer. So for example, if I pick this, it actually tells me what's going on underneath it right there. So there's actually quite a lot of good information that you can see that's going on underneath it right here. Now, here's a problem with what we have. This is instrumentation. While tracing is good, it's telling me what's going on, but sometimes I need to add more details. So in this example, we're going to add more details on get quote and ship order right there. So we want to find out and add more instrumentation, what's going on underneath it, so that we can see more data, what's going on right there. Right now, what I'm teaching you is a concept called observability, where we're adding metadata and attribute in order to improve our observation of that app right there. So I'm going to go out and into my workshop right there. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to find out, and I want to improve observation here and here. And how do I do that? That's where OpenTelemetry is quite important, where you actually need to work with the code in adding observation right there. Adding observation can be done either through automatic instrumentation or manual instrumentation. Automatic instrumentation like Java, .NET can be done because they're the dynamic language and people can insert the what I call instrumentation during runtime. However, certain languages like Golang, Rust, or C, they are compiled language. Therefore, no one can actually do anything on that language, and therefore you have to do manual instrumentation. But the good thing about manual instrumentation is there's no sudden surprises, and you know exactly what you're going to do right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my service right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy paste. Again, just for timing, I probably will not have time to cover every single little thing because in the real world, this workshop is around 1.5 hours, but I'll do my best just to kind of show you the before and after. I'm going to go to main. You can see this is a Golang code. Now, within this workshop, we kind of made it really easy. There's a lot of comments for you to add it. But within this workshop right there, what we're doing is I'm just adding additional code to improve instrumentation on certain functions right there. So you can see there's a lot of things. Now, long story short, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste everything right there. As you can see, what we're doing is we're adding instrumentation to the code and adding more observation into the functions that we're doing right there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to save. And by saving it, the environment will change, and now it will start rebuilding based on the change that we have on the code. And from there, we'll let it wait, and I can show you how does it look like once we add instrumentation into the code in improving observation within the environment. All right, so just propagating the change, and it looks like we're all good right here. Looks like we're very good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my application. I'm going to go to actually show you a mapping view, what we did on the back end. So I'm going to show you on this application what we built. Again, just to save us some time, I already have this all ready to go. What you see right here is called workloads. So workloads is like a bucket within New Relic where I want to kind of classify wherever that I feel that's important. It is possible because you can do that right there. But within workloads, you can see my application dependencies all defined quite nicely for me. And as seen earlier, I use tracing, and all the dependencies actually kind of built out quite nicely for me right there. Okay, so you can see the one that we've been doing is called what I call shipping service. You can see the dependency around it, and you can see data that's flowing through here on the right hand side. So there's a lot of stuff that's actually going on that you see right there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go back to my environment right here. I'm going to go to OpenTelemetry. I'm going to go to shipping service. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to transactions. And I want to actually look at get quote because as mentioned earlier, I'm trying to improve observation in my service right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the latest trace if I can. I want to find out. And what you see right here now, I have more spans that's being expanded right here. This is what I've been adding in the code. That what you see means now I have more visibility and more contextual metadata based on that span right there. What you see right here is actually using attributes as a way of improving observation. It is possible not only through the new Relic agent, but also it is possible through the OpenTelemetry format. So again, this is a quite very common technique that people use to actually instrument their application. But the one I want to show you is again is called ship order, because wouldn't it be cool if we could find out attributes around it right there. So when I go to attributes, what we're doing right here is we're adding more contextual data based on the ship order that we see earlier, so that we have more meaningful contextual data based on what we see right there. So right now, just imagine if something goes wrong, wouldn't it be cool we could find out the request ID, the order ID, the transaction ID, just to really help engineers to figure out and solving problems quicker. What I'm showing here is, again, we're leveraging attributes in improving tracing within the environment that we see right here. All right. Now, I did mention early within this particular environment is within the trace, what we notice right here, there's a few more things. Not only within the trace, we can see a lot of things that's going on. We can pinpoint exactly which area is having an issue, which is actually shipping service right here. But also, if you notice this particular trace map that you see on the top right here, we also automatically identify anomaly spans that you need to be mindful of. This is actually leveraging AI ops, where we are applying AI technologies into the span analysis that we see underneath it. And as part of the investigation and triage, we give you a heads up and say, hey, we did notice something very odd in the environment. Maybe you should pay attention. So that's what we mean right here. So we look for anomalous span. So I'll show an example of error later on, don't you worry. But you can see all the entities will automatically map up to you right there. There's also one more thing that we do quite nicely automatically for you is log correlation. If you use log in context, either by New Relic or you're using the open source format, using OpenTelemetry, we actually correlate quite nicely for you within this log, so that you don't even need to go into the logging platform and try to search for it. So this is done automatically where we do logs correlation together with this trace. So what we want to do is we want to provide data investigation with context, so that we correlate only the right thing at the right time, so that you don't get over bombarded with noise and signal right there. So that's an example of how OpenTelemetry works, where you are using open source telemetry format. You get the data, and we're just using New Relic as a way of lighting the data up, using tracing as a way of seeing where the data is, but also doing all the correlation quite nicely behind on the back end right there. So as mentioned earlier, I've shown you this part, and actually pinpoint quite nicely. Again, one more thing I forgot to show you is ship order. Again, as mentioned earlier, wouldn't it be cool if we could pinpoint exactly where something goes wrong? So we're going to go to errors. We're going to get check out right there. And we can see already there's already one have an issue. And there you go. It automatically do that correlation quite nicely and highlight right here within the UI. And we can see, so that's the address that we had an issue. Therefore, really improving the way how we do observation within what I call distributed architecture microservices. We're using tracing as a way of quickly pinpointing exactly where I need to solve problems. And that's all the errors that's related to that. It's pretty cool, especially early. This is just a different way of solving problems in the world of API and microservices architecture right now. All right, let me flip back to my deck. So as mentioned early, so we kind of gone through a lot of things right there. And also, as I've shown you earlier, what we do right here is not only we use tracing as a way of figure out what's going on, but we also apply AI ops into it, where we use machine learning and pattern recognition, and to actually benchmark what's going on in the previous trace, and we highlight in the UI and say, hey, we noticed something's not right. We need a trace. Do you want to have a look? Especially what I've shown you earlier too. If you're using log in context, we actually correlate the logs quite nicely to the trace, so that you don't need to worry about a lot of problems right now. All right, part two is the collector. Within OpenTelemetry, there are collector is a huge concept. Another way, collector is like ELT, what I call ELT pipeline, event, or what I call extract, load, and transform that's commonly used in data engineering. What I'll show you is actually on the microservices side. One of the interesting value proposition what OpenTelemetry is doing is you can actually also get infrastructure data, and within the collector you have three key concepts. You have receivers, you have processors, and you have exporters. Receivers is pretty much just determine how do you want to get data in. You want to push a pull, it's up to you. And once you get the data in, how do you want to process the data? Do you want to do additional tagging? Do you want to drop certain data? Do you want to enhance the certain data? It's really up to you. But also lastly, you have exporters where you can decide how you want to push data out. This is really subject what you want to do on the back end. But in a nutshell, the collector is really a proxy or what I call a smaller collector to actually collect different type of data and push in the back end. And we're using New Relic just a way of explaining that. So within itself, within the workshop, again, just be mindful of time. I'm going to just shortcut a lot of things. What we're going to do is we're going to collect infrastructure metrics, and I'm going to introduce to you this concept called sampling. In the world of tracing, sampling is quite common because it's quite expensive to collect every single trace, because the reality is you don't really need everything right there. So what we're going to do is we're going to collect infrastructure data as seen right there. You can see right there, previously we're not collecting infrastructure data, we're just collecting application data. And that's what we're going to do right here is we're going to scrape infrastructure data that's being exposed, like what you're doing with Prometheus Explorer. So we're going to do that right there, and we're going to see how does it look like on the back end. And after that, what we're going to do is we're going to use sampling as a way of doing it. In a nutshell, especially in the world of tracing, somebody is going to do sampling, whether you like it or not. Either they're not upfront and honest with you, or you haven't read the fine print. The reason is because in the world of tracing, it's very expensive to store all traces, and therefore, people either use head-based sampling or tail-based sampling. In a nutshell, head-based sampling works very well for statistical analysis through distributed systems, where you don't have time to see everything, while tail-based sampling is a bit more resource constrained, where you collect everything first, but later on, you decide what's more important in your trace data. The reason is mentioned early, tracing data is very expensive, and therefore, most of the time, you only read the data when outages or patterns are occurring. So what with OpenTelemetry, what we're going to do is we're going to do tail-based sampling. Means we only want to collect based on the attributes what we're going to do right there. And therefore, when tail-based sampling is done right, you will see the effect of tail-based sampling, and you actually can see how does it flow right there. Here, either you can use the New Relic, what I call the OpenTelemetry collector on the client side, or you can use New Relic Edge with infinite tracing, which is manage tail-based tracing on the back-end side. So it's really up to you, but I just want you to understand the difference between both of them, okay? So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through the same thing, again, just to speed up a bit more. I'm going to bring it up right here. Copy. We're going to go code editor, and I'm going to go into my collector right here, the OTel collector. So you can see we have some empty spaces right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to collect infrastructure data. I'm going to do tail-based sampling. And after that, once the data is in, I want to ship into the New Relic platform or any platform of choice. And finally, I'm going to define my data pipeline. Paste it, and I'm going to save it right there. Now, this will take a bit of time, but I'll explain what we're doing right there. So what you see on the top right there is we're collecting infrastructure metrics. So we're scraping things like CPU, memory, storage, and additional metrics right there. And you can decide the collection interval. This is where what I call you have absolute control to decide what's right and what's wrong. You have a lot of leeway and decide how much you want to collect. You have a lot of room to decide. This part right here, what we're seeing is, let me just check very quickly to make sure everything is okay. Looks like everything is good. This part right here is called tail-based sampling, where based on the tracing data that we get in, what are the conditions that we want to keep? So it's really up to you to decide how much data that you want to keep. Again, this is just a test data where I say that I want to keep only a certain amount of data. So I want to be very specific. And lastly, what you see right here is actually attributes where I can choose to enhance my data if I want to. And I want to decide, what kind of metrics do I want to get in right there. So you can see we're getting host metrics, and you can see here we're getting tail-based sampling right there. Okay, so just wanted a quick check. Looks like everything's good. We're getting data into the platform. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the new Relic on the back end. I'm going to look at browse data. And I'm going to go to Data Explorer right there. Now, as promised, previously we only collected infrastructure, what I call application metrics. That's it. We didn't collect anything else. But what I want to do is I want to scroll down. And I want to show you, this is what we did earlier. Now we're collecting infrastructure metrics. We're harvesting the same technique that what Prometheus Exporter is doing, but this time we're using the OpenTelemetry collector, and we're getting data into the platform right there. So I'm just going to pick one that people are familiar, we just seen early. So we can see CPU utilization. You can see that data are actually flowing right there. Okay, so you can see the data is flowing. So just to prove that we're collecting infrastructure metrics and it's actually flowing quite nicely in the platform. Now, with tail-based sampling, as mentioned early, with tracing early, what we did is I'm collecting everything right there. But what I want to do is I want to show you the before and after. So what you see now is, let me just change this time here, is previously we've been collecting a lot of trace. We haven't really have any rules, and if you're not careful, you have a lot of data. So applying tail-based sampling, I'm applying some rules, and now I have less tracing data because I'm being selective right there. So that's what I mean with tail-based sampling, where we collect everything first, then we decide what we want to cut and what we want to keep. That's the beauty about tail-based sampling right there. So again, as mentioned, there's no right or wrong. It's just depending on the problem that you want to solve, and you'll pick the right sampling technique right there. Okay. So as mentioned early, because of time, as mentioned earlier, I usually run this workshop like 1.5 hours or 2 hours, usually through meetups or conference and stuff. As mentioned early, this is a Fog Stack Fluent OpenTelemetry Kubernetes where there's a high focus, especially on the OpenTelemetry side. However, if you're interested to run this workshop, you can actually use the New Relic Kubernetes Helm integration, where once you install the Kubernetes integration, we'll start correlating Kubernetes intelligently on the back end. And after that, you can actually use Fluentbit, which is a log aggregator. Again, it's open source, where you actually can collect Kubernetes in container logs and push into the backend platform too. Okay. So as mentioned earlier, I just want to show an example how open source instrumentation looks like. As mentioned earlier, for us in New Relic, it doesn't matter. We support both anyway, because we do have customers that's using both, but you just need to be mindful when to use what with the right use case right there. So as mentioned earlier, we've gone through a lot of things. Let me just wrap it up. In the world of OpenTelemetry instrumentation, there are certain formats and standards you need to be mindful of. And OpenTelemetry on the back end as a collector, just imagine like a proxy where it's collecting data where you have a lot of control how you want to filter and sort data. And lastly, just a quick summary. It's a quite exciting time for open source observability, but you just need to be mindful of your maturity and the standards that what you're going to adopt. Just having data is not observability. You're going to be stuck in the world of monitoring. In the world of observability, you're going to need a mixture of traces, logs, and metrics in order to improve observation. First, in New Relic, we understand customers want both, and we do support both 100%. Not only you can use New Relic agent, but also if you're interested to use OpenTelemetry format into the platform, just go through this lab or just reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you because we want to help engineers use best, because this building systems is very hard. You want to get data based on data, not opinions right there. Okay. With that, thank you so much for your time. My name is Steve. I'm a developer relations lead here in New Relic. I'll be sticking around just to answer any questions you have to. If not, thank you so much, and please enjoy the conference. Thank you so much.